Welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast, the show where Papa Tom spreads wisdom like a smear of cream cheese on an everything bagel. Here's your host, Thom Jennings.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Bagel Logic Podcast. I'm your host, Thom Jennings, and as always, thank you so much for listening, sharing, writing reviews, all that kind of good stuff, and we're slowly but surely making progress, and as has been the case lately, I've been getting some great guests, and this will continue that tradition. So let me introduce Anne Leighton. Now, Anne, I got to know in my life as a freelance music writer, and Anne represented, the one that comes to mind immediately was Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull, but she works with a lot of different people, and she's an artist in her own right. And through our discussions back and forth, emails and communications, I'd found out that we had a connection to the Buffalo area as well, Western New York. So we'll get to talk about all that kind of stuff. But in addition to being, I guess the proper terminology is the publicist, she is also an artist in her own right. So, which I didn't know, which was kind of neat when you sent me over the bio, Anne. But so let me just first start by saying, Anne, thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest. It's great to have you. And maybe if you could just introduce yourself to our listeners and give us a little more background beyond what I've been able to tell everybody.
Sure. Thank you, Tom. And I think it was either Ian Anderson or Grand Funk Railroad that I met Tom through. And he's covered a couple of my artists, and it's always a pleasure. I tend to work with great musicians in either the folk, prog rock, classic rock, or solid gold genres. My roster includes the Kings from Toronto, as well as Phoebe Legere and John Hall and Firefall, and then a range of up-and-coming artists, some that have played the Buffalo market, including Joe Deninzon and Jan Close. And I love to write. And for years, I've been doing spoken word occasionally in the city and started recording it. And I've appeared on a Grammy-nominated album, Healthy Food for Thought, Good Enough to Eat, as well as having a couple of books. One is a poetry book, The Leighton Explosion, which was published in Ontario. Yay! Canada! And I do this character called Bronx Buffalo, which is a hip-hop artist, and it's a feminine girl that wants to be like KRS-One, and she talks about her issues, and she talks about what's wrong with the world, and she can compare both and come up with interesting hip-hop songs. So I'm working on that. It's expensive for me to record because I do need a producer. I don't have my own recording gear, but I'm learning as I go. And that's it.
So Bronx Buffalo, I assume that's the name came from your two worlds, right? I mean, did you grow up in the Bronx and then eventually relocated to Buffalo for a little while? And I think you're in New York City now, right?
Yeah, I'm in the Bronx, and I've been here since the mid-1980s. And to me, both worlds are similar because you have working class people from all different countries, and both towns are port cities, and there is a lot of love in the community, and people know each other. But there's also issues because it's the poor that are struggling on many levels.
So, I mean, is that the theme of the Bronx Buffalo, where you're really talking about, you mentioned that you were talking about current issues and things like that? Is it issues facing, people facing poverty and those types of challenges, or does it touch on just everything?
Yeah. That's the direction my writing has been going in over the past 10 or so years. There are, of course, individual poems, isolated poems that are about love or fighting animals and loving animals, things like that. But most of my writing, most of my poetry has really been based on seeing the comparisons with the world and personal relationships, and what makes a person go into drugs if they're insecure, things like that. And it's based on individual observations, not on a general, hey, what's wrong with the whole world? It's really based on seeing someone's journey and then comparing it to what's going on in different countries and seeing the sickness up close and personal, as well as in the broad story.
Yeah, I guess in some ways that's kind of what I'm trying to accomplish here on Bagel Logic is just, I think a lot of times people get so caught up in the narrative that is like this wide scope where you look at, this is a world problem, whereas we kind of forget like how people have individual problems and how they can be very unique per individual.
Yeah. I like, okay, big world. We're looking at Putin invading the Ukraine as we tape this. And we see that he's difficult and nobody can reason with him. And we have people in our own community that are allegedly community leaders. And they're hurting Blacks, or they're stomping on poor people's rights, or they want to... There's a woman in our community that every time the soup kitchen opens this, maybe one isolated park bench where somebody is leaving their food because they don't like the food that they have. And so she posts a picture of it on Facebook and like, oh, look at what these horrible poor people are doing to our community. They're littering their food on one park bench. And it's like, lady, get over yourself. Really, you're creating drama where there is none. Yeah,
that's crazy. I mean, to think that somebody's so fixated on leaving a bowl of soup on a bench. But I mean, I guess I've lived in small towns for a long time now, and I see a lot of that mentality. Yeah, you see and right now, I think even with gas prices, you start to see how people get very caught up in their own issues, which they're still your own issues. I mean, certainly having to pay more money for gas and other things it can be difficult. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think sometimes we forget about some of just the day-to-day struggles, like people that through no fault of their own have to go to a soup kitchen. I mean, that's got to be a tough condition to be in.
Yeah, and both communities have that. And hey, with gas prices, I just heard Jon Stewart yesterday. And he was interviewing a writer for the New York magazine. And they spoke about, we were supposed to have started last century making the transition off of oil. What happened? And I remember this in the 1970s. People were coming up with ideas to improve the environment. And it's not just me leaving a lighter carbon footprint, which I'm doing through things like diet and through recycling and not having a car, things like that. Taking public transportation 80% of the time. But it is business. Business has been not doing its job. So corporations, here we are. So yeah, there's a lot of folks that want to make changes and are struggling. So there's leadership. And I think leadership is important on many levels, and probably one of the reasons we have so much poverty.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like, I mean, you've had, it sounds like you really are an observant person. Like you do pay very close attention to just the general person's struggles. And I'll tell you why I find that fascinating on some level, because for the longest time, I see your name and I associate it with, Publicist of big name musicians and everything like that. And I think we sometimes forget that behind that, there is those more personal things,
Yeah. I think also all the artists that I work with, Ian and John Hall especially, have been very vocal, and Phoebe Legere. All three of those folks have been super vocal about issues in our community, to the point where they've rolled up their sleeves and made differences or tried to make a difference. And so I like to associate with those types of people. I think I'm also starting, and there may be a Buffalo artist joining my roster at some point. I don't know. I'm not going to say, but I'm starting to work also with disabled artists because I feel closeness with them, with what's been going on. I've been dealing with a couple of disabilities and not knowing it all these years. And it created a lot of anxiety in my life. And when you go into therapy and then you do regular doctor's checkups, you kind of learn as you go, oh, so there are a lot of things in our world where we can roll up our sleeves. And observation, you mentioned that's something that writers have, that superpower where you can see what's going on and make a difference in your own backyard. I speak up too much. That might be one of the mistakes I make. I've not been diplomatic with people, and so I need to use my writing skills to find ways to word more likable phrases to authority figures, make a difference as opposed to, you guys are, I do that a lot still.
Yeah, it's before I started writing about music, I used to write op-ed columns, and it amazed me how many people would get upset, and sometimes they were snarky and all that other stuff. And you're right, it's tough because you have this passion as a writer, and you want people to read it and feel the passion when you're writing, but you have to somehow balance that with this, this being nice, like playing nice, which is kind of contradictory. I mean, if you're a protester, you're protesting something. I mean, you shouldn't necessarily have to play nice, but yeah, it's amazing how I think sometimes that the writer can be vilified for their opinion because the opinion is correct, but they realize that what the writer is saying is okay. But then the tactic is, well, if we go after the writer as an individual and portray them as some kind of mean-spirited person, then the message completely gets lost in the mix. And it's kind of crazy.
Well, I mean, technically it is true that even if you're diplomatic in your message, there are going to be people that will hate you because you're telling them the truth. And some people are not able to accept the truth. You can't handle the truth. From Officer and Gentleman, what a memorable line. But people, I don't know if everybody that gets upset can handle the truth or not. I know even if we look at Facebook and people unfriending you, when you say something like, oh, you did this, or your boyfriend, not knowing the guy's a boyfriend, I'm going to block this guy. He's horrible. And then the girlfriend comes up and says, oh, you're being mean, when you know that he was being mean. And that's happened to all of us.
Yeah, it is definitely a universal experience. I mean, I've had situations where, and again, it's so tough. You get to the point where somebody writes something and they post it, and you have to make that choice whether you want to ignore it and let it go and let it roll off your back, but I feel like sometimes if you don't address some of these situations that are particularly vile, that you're part of the problem. So
yeah, agreed.
Yeah. So I had a weird situation with a relative, and they were writing this really nasty stuff about how I think it was Mexicans and Arabs were taking up all the handicap spots and none of them have jobs and all this other stuff. And, I read it and I'm going, you can't just post something like this and not have people go, hey, you can't say this stuff. I mean, it's perpetuating stereotypes and it's factually incorrect, But we wound up not talking up until the time that she passed away. But I don't regret addressing it because I think I would have felt worse if I just pretended that was okay for her to say it.
Yeah, and I think even if you were gentle and say respectfully, Mary, here's why we disagree. Maybe some are lazy, but most of them probably aren't. I have to remember that periodically. If I see certain people that are falling into similar patterns, I have to remember that the rest of the people from that race or that group, ethnicity. No, it's just individuals. And the same with, I'm Asian and Caucasian. So it's the same with my, and Jewish. And it's the same with my tribes rather, where we have some people that are amazing humanitarians. And then we have some people that are, Putin-like, it's not, it's one bad apple don't spoil the whole bunch.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to kind of pursue too a couple of things that you mentioned as well. You mentioned John Hall, and for people that are listening that don't know John, he was in Firefall, I believe. Yeah.
Orleans.
He was in Orleans. Okay, so it was Orleans. So Orleans, I actually saw him open up for Bonnie Raitt many years ago, and he was on the No Nukes album, if I remember correctly, which goes back one of the early kind of big protest movements in the 70s, and then he went on to become a congressman. I mean, when you say like a guy that maybe talks the talk, he really does. He really has walked the walk his entire career, even up to and including becoming a congressman. And wow, that's pretty cool. I didn't realize that you would work with him. He was somebody that I'd chased for a while, hoping to interview. So maybe after this we'll talk, because I'm a huge admirer of his. But what's he been like to work with? I mean, do you get, when you work with a guy like John Hall, I guess here's the question. Do you get to have conversations beyond the work and maybe talk a little bit more about the bigger things?
Yes. In fact, I think that's why I was so determined to work with him, because years ago I had interviewed Orleans. I think when Chipster was working with them, he's another publicist. He's from the Philadelphia market. And actually Chipster is working the Ian Anderson Jethro Tull album this year. So it's like, hey, I took your artist, you took mine. Give me my artist back and I won't give you mine. So I got to work with Orleans in 2015 for a show, and I decided real hard to just stay in touch with John Hall and read his posts, because it was like, oh yes, this is a guy from my childhood that my friends paid $2 to see. This is how long ago they were seeing Orleans at places like the Capitol Theater in where's the town? Worcester. So yes, we do have conversations. We do talk about the environment. He has given me insight. And actually, he's the one that recently relit fire and anger about the environment in me, because in the 1970s, not the 90s, people were complaining about what was wrong with the environment. And I remember that as a schoolgirl in high school talking about the environment. So there you go. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember, living near Buffalo, Lake Erie, at one point, Lake Erie was a dead lake. That was right around the 1970s. So I'm not sure you went to Fredonia and then you were in Buffalo radio, but I mean, you must remember when Lake Erie was just a cesspool of pollution, and they've managed to, I mean, wouldn't necessarily want to eat fish out of it on a regular basis, but at least it's come a long way since the point that it was just a stinky, horrible place, Yeah,
I remember some graphic stories about Lake Erie from friends even in Cleveland. Yes, I do. I do remember stories. And it got set on fire. That was the big thing.
Yeah, there was so much pollution. It just caught on fire. I mean, and I think you're right. I mean, the first Earth Day was probably in the early 70s, if I remember correctly. So, yeah, environmental considerations. I think a lot of people think that it's a recent push, but it's been a very long culmination of things. And I mean, until you just mentioned it, I hadn't really given much attention to the fact that even back in the 1970s, we were talking about really severely reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. and then we'd make some progress, and then things would. I feel like in this country, when things are going really well, we forget about the things that are going really bad, and that's where I mean, I see so many pickup trucks and huge vehicles on the road now as the price of gas has doubled, and it's like, man, when did we get to the point where we just didn't even consider getting economy vehicles anymore? I mean, there was a period of time where people just weren't buying those giant gas guzzlers,
Yeah, and there are solutions, including creating regional economies, where if you divide the United States up into its different quadrants, like the Northeast and the Midwest, and Ohio and Buffalo can connect. It doesn't have to be pure Midwest. It could be states, border states, where you create local economies where everybody, and you first manufacture in health services and food services, and then build it, and you can build all the other fields. You will end up saving this country. You will end up improving local economies. More people will be working, will be building in America. We won't have to hire. We'll get rid of the whole NAFTA agreement, which is what President Clinton did in the 1990s, I think.
Yeah, it was mid-90s.
Yeah. You will improve the local economy, you'll get people to work, and you will improve the environment. And more people will have more money, and it won't be so expensive. And gas, forget that. You'll have, if you're creating regional economies, transportation, if you're in Buffalo and you need to get lobsters, let's say, from Maine, transportation from Maine to New York, or from Massachusetts to Buffalo, New York, it'll be affordable. It'll be and they could probably use cooking oil for gas as opposed to petrol for gas, or electricity, because we're building, also New York State is building electric, quote, gas stations, electric service stations.
Yeah, we definitely have a few of those out here. So I'm curious, when did you become really socially conscious? Was this something in high school, or did you grow up with parents that were very socially conscious? And
you know what? My mom taught me to fight City Hall, and I remember my father talking about reaching out to his local political representative. I don't know if it was the town hall or if it was a congressperson, and they never called back. They never did anything. And it's like, well, maybe I won't vote for this person. And like, ooh. But yeah, it's like, if I'm in public service or if I'm in customer service, I'm going to be of service. And no one's perfect 100% of the time, but you can go through your email, let's say at the end of the week, and go, oh, I didn't get back to this person. I'll send them a note. I'll work on them, that type of thing. It's very hard to be on top of things 100% of the time, but you want to make the effort. You want to give the personal touch. So yeah, that's where it happens.
I can vouch for the fact that you do. I mean, there's probably a handful of publicists that those of us in the music writing world that will mention that are easy to work with, that usually get back to. I know you mentioned Chipster. He's one that I've always had a really good experience with, and you and a couple other ones. But But I still do get, some people that just say, oh, you're just the guy from the small newspaper in Western New York. You're not worth my time. And it's
right.
And I think people forget that maybe somewhere down the road, I mean, I'm probably too old to become a nationally prominent writer, but still, you still should treat people decently, because that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, I think that if you don't treat people decently, I think it's going to be hard. You're going to put out bad vibes. So yeah, it's nice to be nice.
And how did you wind up getting into doing the whole publicist work? I mean, I know you mentioned that you were doing some into the bio and everything, that you worked in Buffalo radio, of course, with GooGoo Dolls and Talas, the big two out here, and some other people. But how did that all translate into working with people like Grand Funk and Ian Anderson? And John Hall.
I was a music journalist. I worked in radio in Buffalo, and I started writing also in Buffalo. Rick Falkowski, Mr. Buffalo historian, used to run a newspaper called the Buffalo Backstage, which later became Nightlife. And he got me writing in Buffalo. And I've always written, but in Buffalo, he got me into music journalism. And I worked in music journalism from about 1981 while working at the hardware store in Chappaqua. And then I segued from the hardware store to working full-time at a rock magazine, Hit Parader, for about 10 years. And during that time, I learned through osmosis how to do publicity. And I think I developed my own style in the sense of responding to people. To be fair to some of the major label publicists, even though they have staffs of people that could write back, I never really worked the superstar act. So I don't know what it's like if I'm working, let's say, with Bruno Mars or Adele now. I don't know if I could spend the time to get back to everybody that writes me. But I would say if I'm working with Bruno Mars, that I would have a staff of people and somebody should be responsible for writing back to journalists. I think that is correct. It takes 5 seconds to send an email. I'm sorry, we're only giving interviews to the big media outlets, not crickets. You know, I think somebody needs to. That's one of the nice things. Marilyn Laverty, she works with Bruce Springsteen and big people. Her staff writes back with a no. If hey, come on, get me an interview with, or something like that. I would say 90% of the time, her people write back. So if she can do it, if her staff can do it, so can Bruno Mars's staff, I'm sure. I don't know if Bruno Mars is. I'm just pulling Bruno Mars because I think he's a big rock star. Yeah,
he's got a keyboard player from the Rochester, New York area too, so he always does some media stuff. But nice. I think it's interesting. I guess I didn't. I mean, Nightlife magazine, I think finally went out of business within the last couple of years. My friend Gus wrote for them, and I don't know if they're still around, but I think the last he told me that they were kind of defunct. But Hit Parader, man, that was a really cool magazine. I read that all the time growing up. I didn't realize that you wrote for them. So I guess in many ways you've had a very well-rounded career in terms of understanding both sides of the coin, where trying to get those interviews and the importance of getting them at deadlines and all that kind of stuff.
What do you remember what bands were in Hit Parader when you read it? When I was growing up, I was a big Styx fan. You know, a lot of the kind of REO Speedwagon, things like that. Those were my bands I was listening to growing up. And then later, of course, Todd Rundgren, and the people can't see us because we're on Zoom, but I have a bunch of Todd stuff on the wall and everything. So you see, you were reading it when Lisa Robinson was editing it, because we switched it to heavy metal. About 1986, 85, 86-ish. 84, 85, 86.
Yeah, so I would have been reading it probably late 79 to 83, 84-ish.
Yeah.
So that sounds about right with those bands. So
yeah, Lisa was the editor.
Well, that's cool. So who's your, I mean, I guess maybe we'll start with horror stories before we start with your favorites. I know I have a couple of artists that I interviewed that when people ask me, they go, who's the most difficult artist you ever interviewed? Who was the most difficult artist that you ever worked with that you could say without stepping on any toes, I guess is the
I don't know if I'm capable of doing that. I mean, I've had a couple of artists that it just took me a while to find interviews for, and they got upset. And I also had one artist that I got him some interviews, and he's like, "Oh, is that crappy newspaper from the block? No, I don't want to do that." Or magazine, you know. So I've had I've had artists that didn't like the fact that I got them crappy press, and I've had artists that I struggled to get press for. So, and understandably, yeah, if I were an artist, I would be upset if the publicist wasn't getting any press as well. So,
yeah, and it's got to be tough though. I mean, sometimes it's got to be with a certain artist. It's got to be easy to find the interviews. Said like a Bruno Mars, maybe everybody and their mother is trying to interview them, but there's other artists where it's just tough to really get the word out there because people aren't that familiar with them. But I think where you probably have an advantage in your roster is that you've got some familiar names, so that at least, I mean, I know my experience of an artist, if a publicist that I have a good relationship with sends me an article and says, hey, look, this person really needs some press coverage. Can you help me out? I'd do it in a heartbeat.
I'll remember that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll remember that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like to have that kind of reputation, but the reality is, I think when, I don't know how old you are. I'm 55 years old. I mean, the reality is when you get to be about in your 50s, it's harder to find new music because you're so, you kind of have your core group of people that you like. So, so in order to be, for even me personally as a journalist to be exposed to new music, I'm kind of dependent on somebody sending me an artist that I've never heard of because I don't really seek out a lot of new artists. I see them if they come to town. I see them if I get an email or that kind of thing, and that's it.
Well, what I do to stay up with new music, and I really try to do this 2 or 3 times a week, is either listen to contemporary top 40 or a station like WFUV. That most of the public radio stations that have locally generated programming are playing the hits for their genre, or you can listen to playlists on some of the things like Apple or Spotify or Pandora. I discovered actually on Spotify, that's where I first heard Courtney Barnett and Bebe Rexha, who are 2 young artists that are favorites. And there are a bunch of other artists that I've heard on YouTube. I think that's probably where I first heard Bruno Mars. And I'm working currently with Felix Cavalieri for New York shows. And in some ways, Bruno Mars is a modern day Felix. He might not play Hammond B3, but he's got that voice on him. He's blue-eyed soul. Well, he's blue-eyed soul-ish, kind of. ish.
I agree with you. I like Bruno as well for that very reason. I think he's got a very soulful sound. I mean, there's some of his stuff that reminds me a little bit of even Tower of Power with the big horns and things like that. And I'm glad you mentioned Courtney Barnett too, because that was one my son introduced me to. My youngest son, he's 29 now, but I think a couple of years ago he gave me a Courtney Barnett vinyl, and I was like, wow, this stuff's pretty cool. And she's definitely an up and coming artist. Yeah. But yeah, it's
one of a kind.
It very much so. Yeah, I think she's. I'm not really super familiar with. I think my son said she was on maybe Kimmel or one of the late night shows. So she's getting around. But yeah, I mean, if people out there are listening haven't heard her yet, she's definitely somebody that you want to give a listen to. Very unique but yet still has kind of an old music sensibility. And that's that timeless thing. Like Felix. I mean, that's Felix's music just really doesn't get old because even though it was popular at one point, the songs still hold up.
The big thing, Elton John would always say, hey, I want to stay up. And I mean, the reason why Elton John is where he is because he's always listening to top 40 music. And I think recently, even though I wasn't a fan of the album, because he had done a collaboration with Charlie Puth, who I love, and I didn't feel that duet was good sounding. Belonged on an Elton album because it wasn't that. There was something weird about the ambience of both voices together that I didn't like. But still, that's what Elton does: is he's listening to kids. He's listening to the charts.
So we're getting to the point where we're going to start wrapping up in a little bit. And one of the other things I wanted to touch on, because you mentioned it earlier, and I thought it was kind of cool. So you said you're going to be working with some artists that have disabilities. And I guess I don't know, that's not something I've necessarily thought about, but there's got to be, I mean, I know we have like Special Olympics and all these other types of things for whatever's. How did you kind of start thinking about getting into that, and what's the story behind it? I think it's probably going to be fascinating.
I've discovered that I've had a number of disabilities ever since childhood that were never tapped. And I joined a group called RAMPed, which is Recording Artists, Music Professionals with Disabilities, rampd.org, rampd.org. And one of the artists mentioned me to a musician. And then I got some other emails from a few other people. And I'm like, maybe I should be working with disabled artists. Let me start creating something about that because of the requests that I had been getting. And not all of the artists were great musicians per se, but they all had interesting stories about themselves. So it's something that I want to do and I could see myself doing. I still have homework to do on it because I want to find out more about the market, the different media outlets that deal with disabilities, and see what the possibilities are. But it's something I really believe I should be doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that I'm aware. I mean, I imagine somebody's doing something along those lines, but I mean, I don't know. I find it very fascinating. It's one of those things you don't necessarily think about, but ultimately music and musicians and poetry, and I know all the different artistic ventures that you're involved in and that I'm involved in, a lot of it is just meant to inspire people. So it's, and we're always looking for somebody that's a little bit like us. So people with disabilities that maybe feel constrained that they can't create music, I think this would be an opportunity to really, create some inspiring stories in the form of music.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. And a lot of the songs, I've listened to some of the playlists on some of the streaming services, and a lot of the songs might not be as well produced, but the messages are about what they go through. So they're writing from their hearts. And I think it's a story in this day and age where people are so out to stomp on everyone. That's odd. I think it's saying, no, I'm not that odd. I have a story and I want you to listen to it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's a sad reality, I think, of the social media, which social media has great, there's great possibilities, and, people can use it for good, but man, there is, I think, especially with people that are a little bit different and kids going through high school and things like that, it can be a very, very difficult thing to maneuver.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's what we're here for. We're really here to grow together. So I like that idea. It feels like something I should be doing.
Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, it seems like you put together artists that you work with that are at least somewhat like-minded and everything. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like you do anything without being very thoughtful. You know what I mean? I mean, it must be easy sometimes I know in my case, like, for instance, if I'm going to write an article, I mean, there's got to be a part of me that it appeals to me. I can't just write about anybody or just do anything for anyone. But sometimes you just have to say, well, I just got to do this because either I got to get paid or I need to meet a deadline or those kinds of things. But it's nice to hear that you're able to kind of carve together a very unique career and a pretty cool set of artists that appeal to you more than just as musicians, but as human beings.
Yeah, I think I'm lucky, but it may also be because I'm just going down that path that these things are coming to me. I don't know. I'm grateful.
Very good. Well, I guess we'll wrap up, and thank you very much. I said I didn't really know what direction everything would go in when we were chatting, but I'm glad we had a chance to get to know each other a little bit better, and I think we should do this again at some point. I know you.
Okay.
I know you
Tomorrow?
mentioned. You're like, yeah. Pretty soon we're just gonna have our daily podcast, Tom and Ann. I mean, who knows if there's a radio station out there that wants to pick it up, I would be happy to put it on there. But I appreciate it. But before I go, I want you to tell the audience a little bit more about some. Again, I know you said you wrote some books and everything, and you'd sent me some stuff in the bio. Where can they find out some more information about you and your particular artistic endeavors?
Okay, so I have a website, AnneLeighton.com, and it's AnneLeighton.com or .co.za, because I also have a South African site. It's the same site, and I have a story there, and I have about Anne, and I also have something that folks can download about consulting. It's a free ebook, and my artists are there. I have to update a couple of artists, and I will put this interview when it gets published. I'll put this on the website within a week of posting. I will do that.
Well, very cool. And when I first came up with this concept for the Bagel Logic podcast, you volunteered to listen. I had sent you the file. I don't think you were able to listen to it because I did something wrong when I sent it to you, but I appreciated you were offering. Yeah, you couldn't get it to open, but you at least got back to me and said, I can't get this thing to open. And but I appreciate you willing to be a part of it, even at the early stages, so we were able to kind of get this thing off and running. So, and being from the Bronx, I mean, you appreciate the wonders of a good bagel as well.
I actually, periodically I get bagels. I should be doing more keto than I do, but no. And the two bagels that I love the most are the everything bagel, toasted with lots of butter and American cheese and tomato, or a BLT or imitation bacon with lettuce, tomato, onion, and extra mayo.
Oh, very good. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you everybody out there for listening to the Bagel Logic podcast. We've got some more great guests coming up, and maybe one of these days I'll get John Hall on here. Who knows? He would be.
We'll do it.
We'll work on it. That would be that'd be one off my bucket list. But once again, this is Thom Jennings thanking you for listening to the Bagel Logic podcast.